We got a lot to get into on this Eagles win. John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. He has a plethora of articles for you to peruse on our website right now, one of which is his observations from yesterday's win, John, in a win that, you go on the road, which wasn't really a road game. I mean, it was loud there for the Eagles in a weird environment, but they snuck out of there, and a game that a lot of people thought that they might not be able to sneak out of there. Were you impressed with the 26-24 victory?
I was. I thought it was a trap game a little bit. I think you did as well, coming off an emotional in-division game against the Giants and traveling across country. So I thought it was a logical sort of place to show up and not be ready to play, and the Eagles were prepared, unlike maybe what Mike Lombardi thinks, but and they managed to hold on and get the win. Leaking oil again in the fourth quarter, but this time it wasn't Jake Elliott. It was the best 4-minute offense you'll ever see, and that's one that lasts 6 minutes and 44 seconds.
Let's get a couple of the observations from you at 97.3 ESPN.com. You talked about leaking oil. A lot of X plays in that game. The big play almost did them in.
Yeah, it really did. I mean, you think about everything, 75-yarder to Williams. You had a 50-yarder to Allen, a 49-yarder. You had the big run, 35 yards. So generally, when you give up that many explosive plays in the NFL, you're not going to win the football game. And, Doug Peterson talked about that today. It's just there's been a lot of injuries on the defensive side of the football. That's not an excuse, but it's just reality, especially on the back end in the secondary, and it tends to show up. Young players who don't have a lot of experience, like Rasul Douglas, can play well for periods, but then they have the hiccups, and you see the big plays develop, and we've seen that with the Eagles secondary, and you just got to hold on until Ronald Darby gets back. Rodney McLeod obviously was back. Corey Graham is getting closer. Jalen Watkins is getting closer. And the Eagles have been able to do that. So while you can pick things apart and talk about the Eagles performing poorly in the fourth quarters, hey, they're winning football games. And that's what the NFL is. You got to move forward. You got to overcome injuries. And to through a quarter of the season, the Eagles have been able to do that.
Well, they're winning football games, and a lot of it has to do with the way they've game planned. And obviously, Blunt, Clement, the three-headed monster, Wendell Smallwood, that's a big factor.
Yeah, they obviously ran the football, and you got to give the offensive line a ton of credit. They dominated run blocking. It's partially they're playing really well, especially when Wisniewski's at left guard. And the Chargers can't stop anybody on the ground. I mean, they're one of the worst run-defending teams in the NFL. So you sort of saw two trains colliding, and then the Eagles were the ones doing the damage as far as the offensive line. There were a lot of big holes yesterday, and that's obviously a good thing, and that essentially is what sealed the game, because once Hunter Henry makes that catch, which was a brilliant touchdown catch in the end zone, you kind of got the feeling, the momentum has shifted in this game. The Chargers fans that were there were cheering and alive, and all of a sudden they don't even get the ball back. It's just under 7 minutes to go. They don't give the ball back to Phillip Rivers. And that is difficult to do. And there were a couple passes in that final drive, but the vast majority was just running it right down their throat. And a lot of it was particularly Jason Peters and Jason Kelsey. Peters was just caving in the right side of the Chargers line at times.
John, how about your impression of Wendell Smallwood as he had to step up to an increased role?
Yeah, I mean, it went sort of as expected in that LeGarrette obviously ran the football more, but Wendell was actually on the field more. He was on the field for more offensive snaps, sort of the Darren Sproles role. That's what he's taken over. He was able to catch the football pretty well, and that's the most traffic he's seen catching the football since he was a junior at West Virginia, so he's not used to that. Ran the football, not great, but effectively got the big touchdown. So it's all positive as far as that running back by committee, at least over the last 2 weeks.
Were you surprised that it was Corey Clement getting a couple of carries on 3rd and short late in the game instead of one of the other two guys? Were you surprised that Doug went that way?
Yeah, I was. And that's, I think at some point that could crop up as being a problem for this team. I think they're too stringent on sort of plans coming into the game and regular rotations. We mentioned Wisniewski and rotating with Chance Warmack. And they have this mentality they're going to rotate in the backfield. But you got a guy, LeGarrette Blount, who's just dominating. Why isn't he getting the football in key situations? Even Wendell, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it seems like they came into the game thinking, okay, this is Corey's turn. Maybe he's fresher. That's the only thing I can think of. But I think from that standpoint, I think it's fair to say, look, if LeGarrette Blount is performing the way he's performing, you got to feed him. And I think he could have touched the ball more. And I don't know too many people that would disagree with that.
John, so much was brought up about the receiving core and the acquisitions of Torrey Smith and Alshon Jeffrey. Have they lived up to your expectations so far, especially Torrey Smith?
Well, no, I mean, Torrey Smith is out there tweeting. He admitted he's in the middle of the worst slump of his career, which I thought was interesting semantically, because you don't want him to be in the middle, because then you got to deal with 4 more games of this. But beyond that, it's not true, because he was flat out awful last year in San Francisco. And he hasn't been that bad. But I think at some point you got to realize Torrey Smith is what he is. And right now I've been saying it dating back to the off season. I mean, he could do some things for you because he can still run and stretch the field. But if you're expecting him to be a consistent receiver, catching 4 or 5, 6 passes each and every week, that's just not him. That's just not who he is. No. He's not that type of receiver.
No, but you're also not seeing the big numbers from Alshon Jeffrey yet either. I mean, what do you attribute? I mean, is that because of the run game? They don't really know how to use Alshon yet. Did you expect to see bigger numbers from Alshon in the passing game?
Yeah, I expect to see a little bigger. I mean, if you look at the whole picture, I expected the volume guys to be Zach Ertz and Jeffrey, and they are, but Ertz is ahead of them. And that's not necessarily a surprise. And then it's Nelson Aguilar. And I expected that as well once Jordan Matthews was traded. So it's gone as I expected, but people are going to complain. I mean, when they were throwing the ball all over the lot, the numbers are obviously better, but they weren't running the football, so people are complaining about the run-pass ratio. Well, when you're running the football, your numbers throwing the football aren't going to be as good.
John, we talked about on the countdown to kickoff yesterday how this offense is very reminiscent of those Andy teams with the 3-headed monster, and you just ask McNabb to make a couple plays. Just be a playmaking quarterback more than a elite guy, or you're the reason why we win. It's almost like back then when they just said to Donovan, just make a couple plays.
Yeah, I mean, I think the game has evolved, even though that's not that long ago. And I mentioned this to Josh off air. There are going to be certain teams you go up against, especially if you make the playoffs, you're going to have to throw the football. Green Bay being a perfect example. And I mentioned Chicago because the one thing Chicago does well is run the football. And they had Kyle Long back, and they have Josh Sitton and Cody Whitehair, and Charles Leno's gotten better. And they can run the football. And they show up to face Green Bay, and they're down 14-0, and you either throw it or you're done. In the case of the Bears, they're obviously done because they're not capable of throwing it. So the passing game has to improve. It might not have to improve against 0-4 teams, but eventually you're going to face quarterbacks that can just throw it all over the lot, and you're going to have to make plays through the air. So things do have to improve. I think the chemistry between Carson Wentz and Alshon Jeffrey has to improve. Casey Hayward's one of the best cornerbacks in football. People don't know that. He kind of shut down Jeffrey. But I think part of it goes back all the way to training camp. You think about how much time Jeffrey missed, and the Eagles kind of put him in bubble wrap because they didn't want him hurt, and they just wanted to get to week 1. So I think in a lot of ways, both of them, Carson and Alshon, are just kind of working through it together, and it's in season instead of the preseason.
John McMullen's with us. You wrote about the late game defensive struggles. What's happening with this team late in the games?
Well, it's not, you could have argued, and some people are asking about conditioning. They were barely on the field. I mean, the Eagles had the football for almost 40 minutes. So I don't think you can talk about conditioning this week. Maybe last week when it was so hot at Lincoln Financial Field, you could kind of make that argument. But this week, no way. It's just a matter of fact of young guys in the secondary, communication issues, gap control when it comes to the run game and the big run. All of that comes into it, but you would hope it would improve once you get Darby back, once you get Graham back, once you get Watkins back. Jordan Hicks was able to play. Fletcher Cox obviously will be back at some point, but you can't criticize Bo Allen because he was great.
John McMullen's with us here on the Sports Bash on 97.3. How about Patrick Robinson, John? What has he brought to the defense?
Well, Patrick Robinson has been lights out, and that's one of the biggest surprises of this defense to me. I did not see that coming. But you look at his history, he's had a real difficult time staying healthy at times. He's a former first-round pick. He had a real good season when he was out with the Chargers in San Diego. And then he's kind of fallen off the table. And this year the Eagles moved him to the slot cornerback position after they acquired Ronald Darby. He's just very comfortable. Pro Football Focus had that stat. He was on the field for, I think, 25 pass coverage snaps. Phillip Rivers didn't throw at him, not once. That's kind of stuff you don't see. That's Patrick Peterson stuff. Now, by no means am I trying to say Patrick Robinson is that good, but he's a talented guy, and he's playing at a high level right now, and it's really helping this defense because they're up against it on the outside with Jalen Mills and Rasul Douglas. So the fact that he's playing so well in the slot has really helped them get through these past 2 games.
Let me ask you a couple of Doug questions. First and foremost, today he was asked about how much he's contributing on the defensive side of the ball. Does he get involved with that at all? Is Doug reaching over to the defensive side a little of the ball more to have more conversations?
No, well, he kind of explained, and I'm sure people will run with this, that it's Jim's show on game day, but that's the way it works in the NFL. I mean, if you're an offensive-minded head coach, you hire a defense coordinator, and that side of the ball is his. I mean, during the week, they have conversations, and if Doug wants something to happen or he doesn't like something that's happening, that's where he puts his 2 cents in. But the defensive side of football is Jim Schwartz's. And, as a perfect example, if you look at the toast of the town early season in the NFL right now is Sean McVay as the youngest coach in NFL history. Has completely turned around the Los Angeles Rams. Jared Goff looks like, from a guy who didn't deserve to be drafted at all to being the number 1 overall pick again. He's got him going in the right direction. And if you watch a Rams game, he doesn't even pay attention when the defense is on the side. He goes and he talks to his offense and looks at play charts, and he doesn't even pay attention because that's Wade Phillips' job.
Yeah, he mentioned that after the game. He brought that up after the game that, hey, Wade Phillips, give him credit for the defense because I'm not really hanging out with him too often. It's kind of interesting. Wade's, in his 70s, and you got McVay who's in his early 30s, the dynamics of that whole situation there. And, of course, similar with Doug and Jim. I mean, he just lets Jim kind of handle it.
And he should. I mean, that's why he hired him. That's his expertise, and he's very good at it. So I think you'll see some people run with that and say Doug is not this or Doug is not that, but they don't realize that that's the way the NFL works.
Yeah.
Just about every coach in this league has a specialty, either on the offensive or defensive side, and the other side, they let their coordinator handle it.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com. Of course, national NFL columnist at FanRag Sports. Follow him at JF McMullen. Let's hit on a couple of quick national games and get your take on the Dallas game yesterday. They lose to the Rams at home. What ails the Cowboys?
Well, I think not necessarily anything ails them, and I say this with the New York Giants as well. The expectations were out of whack because they overachieved last season, and they were going to come back to the pack. I've been talking about it for months, and it's going to be much more difficult for them, and that's how things have kind of unfolded. They have some issues. They don't have a ton of talent on the defensive side of the football. People are sort of, committing to stopping Ezekiel Elliott as much as they can, and they're forcing Dak Prescott to beat them. So that's sort of the blueprint, and I think late last season that was Mike Zimmer kind of came up with it, and that's what this league is. It's a copycat league, and people are following it, and until he makes adjustments, it's probably going to be difficult. They're still a decent above average football team.
Yeah.
But people who think they were going to win 13 games, it just wasn't going to happen.
How about the Giants? 0-4 now. I mean, a couple of years ago, they got off to like an 0-6, 0-7 start, put themselves back into playoff contention. Do you see that with this team?
No. I think this is closer to the real Giants than last year. I think last year was the anomaly. They had, and I talked about it a lot on the show last year. I mean, they had such a small margin of error because their offense is so bad. Their defense had to win basically every football game. And they made big plays. They had big stops, and that just can't continue on the long term. And it sort of regresses back to the mean, and that's what's happened to the New York Giants. They have a terrible offensive line. They can't run the football. And I often say, I wrote about it today on FanRag Sports, they got a quarterback whose best traits are his last name and his jewelry box. I mean, that's it. He's overrated. I don't know how many times I said it on this show. They're not a good football team. And are they 0-4 bad? Probably not. But are they an 11-win team? Nowhere close. And I think this has become a three-horse race in the NFC East, and the Giants are the one out of it.
So, John, what are we going to find out about the Washington Redskins tonight?
That's that third horse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the Redskins, I think, is the team everybody underrated because everyone assumed the Redskins were going to be bad because of things that happened in the front office. And that could have happened because there's a ton of dysfunction. There's no question. But talent-wise, the Redskins got a lot of good players. So, and that's what's showing up. And we'll see. They have a very difficult test because obviously Kansas City, that's a top 5 team in this league. So all of a sudden, people might have argued that with the Raiders as well. But I think the Raiders kind of got exposed, not only playing Washington, but also Denver. If they show up and play well against Kansas City, you're going to say this is a much better team. And I think a lot of it has to do, they've gotten better defensively, and a lot of it is due to Greg Minuski, the new defensive coordinator.
So much happened the other day. John, what was the biggest surprise yesterday to you? Just in the 1 o'clock games, there was enough surprises to last you for the day. What's if you're writing your national column on what stands out for FanRag, what stood out yesterday at the quarter pole?
Well, I think just how bad the Patriots are defensively. A couple things, and the AFC East as a whole. I mean, the New York Jets can't even tank right because they're winning football games. And by the way, who would have thought the best team in New York was the Jets and not the Giants? Because they didn't get the memo, the players.
Or Buffalo. Buffalo's in New York.
Yeah, and Buffalo's winning that division, and they're arguably trying to take as well.
There you go.
So that AFC East is certainly. But when you talk about the front seven of the Patriots, they have nothing other than Dante Hightower, who, and I'll tell you how bad it got. If you go back to the kickoff weekend, the kickoff of the NFL season game against the Chiefs, they had him playing on the edge, and he's typically an inside linebacker. So they just don't have much talent in the front seven. And I think some of those decisions of walking away for Chandler Jones and Jamie Collins is finally coming back to haunt them. And they've had a ton of communications issues in the secondary and then the back seven as a whole. Part of that was Hightower was out, so that should improve moving forward, but there's just not a lot of horses on that defense.
Johnny Mack, of course, every day with the latest on the NFL here on the Sports Bash. Follow him at JF McMullen. And don't forget, every Sunday on the Countdown to Kickoff show, the guys will be live at McFadden's at the ballpark on Sunday for Eagles and Cardinals. Johnny Mack, take care, pal.
Hey, thank you, guys.